Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. I hope you guys are doing well today. I hope you're in a good mental state because today's case is definitely not one for the faint of heart because today's case features a bunch of people who were at fault. I mean, any one of them could have stopped this tragedy at any time and none of them did. So it's just especially important, in my opinion, to shine a spotlight on them all of them, all of the guilty people. But it's not an easy story here. So you know what, we're just gonna jump right in. In early 2024, Kinsleigh Welty was just 5 years old, living in Indianapolis, Indiana. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, these adorable little chubby cheeks, a round button nose, and like a lot of kids her age, she was just extremely bubbly, and she was really starting to develop into her own personality, her own traits, her own interests. She loved Paw Patrol, Bubble Guppies. She was a total girly girl at this stage, loving everything that had to do with it, playing dress up, princesses. I mean, if you wanted to play with her, she would literally sit in front of you and just let you do whatever you wanted to do with her hair, braid it, do it. I mean, she loved all of it. A girly girl through and through. She also was a little Swiftie. Her favorite song by Taylor Swift was You Need to Calm Down, which, if you guys know that song, you know how funny that is for a 5-year-old to be obsessed with it. But if that song came on, it was pretty much guaranteed that Kinsleigh was just going to start singing, dancing, and Swifting out. Now, pictures of Kinsleigh made it seem like she was this very happy, carefree child. But as we know, pictures aren't always accurate because the majority of her life was not normal. It was not healthy. Now, because this is an ongoing case and all of this information surrounding Kinsleigh's life is just now slowly starting to become public, there are a lot of things that I've sort of had to piece together almost like a puzzle. But I do know that in December of 2018, which was when Kinsleigh wasn't even a month old yet, there was an incident when the police had to go to the home where Kinsleigh's parents, Toni and Bradley, were living at the time. Toni had called for an ambulance because she had a possible gallbladder rupture. She had to get to the hospital right away because of this. Bradley was still at work, and there wasn't anybody else to handle childcare, to watch Kinsleigh. So when the ambulance responded, there was this 1-year-old and a 3-week-old child just at home without any other caregivers around. So Toni couldn't just leave the kids home alone, and Bradley wasn't home either. So a couple of police officers came over to keep an eye on the babies, all until Bradley got home. Well, when the police got there and went inside, they were immediately baffled and taken aback by just how horrible and disgusting the living conditions were. There were cigarette butts, moldy food, garbage, dirt just thrown all over the ground. And because of all of the food that was old and left out, there were just a ton of flies and gnats flying around. The couch, the mattress, they were both just as dirty. It was gross. Now, speaking of the bathroom, the bathroom actually had fecal matter, poop that had never been cleaned up. In the kitchen, there was, again, just moldy food, garbage all over the place, and it looked as if the garbage hadn't been taken out in weeks, if not months. And as awful as all of that sounds, that's just how the house looked. The kids were in even worse condition. The police saw that both babies had full diapers and that they had been full for a long enough time that they both had rashes because of it. They were filthy from head to toe, so no doubt just from being in that house, but also it was very clear that they hadn't been given baths in a while. The 1-year-old was on the ground playing with some rotten potatoes and crawling around all sorts of different choking hazards, sharp objects like a pair of scissors, which were literally just lying out within reach. There were a bunch of other concerning things too, like a mattress that was leaning up against the wall and a closed door that wasn't fully secure. I mean, things that could have both easily been, knocked over by a 1-year-old. And if they had hit either the baby or the 1-year-old, which is also a baby, they could have easily both been hurt. So the police also noted that the 3-week-old, Kinsleigh, she did not appear to be in good health at all. The court documents say that she was lethargic. Her body and her lips were pale in color, and her mouth was extremely dry. She was also covered in filth, which says a lot, especially since it's not like she was even big enough to be crawling around this nasty floor and getting herself dirty. She was stationary. A 3-week-old just literally sits like this, like a potato. So how is she getting so dirty? The living conditions were bad enough that the officer immediately called for DCS to report to the scene. Both babies were evaluated, and neither one of them was doing very well. The 1-year-old had dried snot all over his nose and mouth, and the police officer noted that while he was holding him, he could feel the rattle in his chest every single time he inhaled and exhaled. Kinsleigh was very severely malnourished and ended up being diagnosed with a failure to thrive diagnosis. They also found a rash on the back of her head, which would usually only happen if she had been laying in one spot for an extended period of time. Like I said, remember, a 3-week-old sits like this, a potato, doesn't move, barely has a lot of head motion at that point. So think about that to get like kind of almost like bed sores, but a head sore. It makes me sick to my stomach to even think about it, and I'm just going by what I read after the fact. I mean, for the police officers who were actually there responding to this scene, it must have been something that was just so incredibly heartbreaking to see. So these officers were doing everything that they could to take care of these babies, but each thing that they tried to do just opened up their eyes to this like whole new level of neglect. For example, I mentioned earlier that both of the babies had full diapers, so the officers were going to change them both, clean them up. But when they went looking for fresh diapers, they couldn't find any. And it was a total shock because in a household with 2 babies, there literally weren't any clean diapers or wipes anywhere to be found in the house. Meanwhile, the diapers that the kids had on were bulging with urine, feces. I mean, the feces had been in there for so long that it was literally dried up, and that told them just how long they had probably been sitting in their own filth. And when Kinsleigh started crying, they figured, okay, we're going to go make you a bottle because she's probably hungry, right? She's malnourished after all. So the officer cleaned up one of the bottles that they found a bottle of water in her car to mix up some formula, and she made sure that another officer went and bought some packs of diapers, wipes, so that they could just get these children cleaned up. They also bought some of those like Gerber puffs, like almost looks like cereal, but it's softer. They bought this for the older baby so that both of the babies could be fed. And both of the kids ate like they hadn't in such a long time. I mean, they were just so incredibly hungry. Now remember, while all of this was going on, the mother, Toni, was at the hospital. She found out that DCS was going to her house, and she very noticeably and without any shame began freaking out. Probably because she knew just how bad it was going to look. You can't just talk your way out of something like that, right? So she begged them to let the officers know that a, quote, family friend was just going to stop by the house and watch the kids. So because of this, it wasn't necessary at all for the police and DCS to come over. Now, of course, the officers had already seen enough, and they shut that down completely. So Toni was arrested, and she was charged with 4 counts of neglect. And you might be wondering, okay, well, why 4? There were only 2 kids. Well, the babies weren't the only children that she was responsible for. There were actually 4 kids in total living in that house. Along with Kinsleigh and the 1-year-old that I mentioned before, Toni also had a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. Both of those kids were either with their dad or other family members when the police and DCS arrived, and when they saw how terrible the home environment was, which thank goodness that they weren't there. Kinsleigh's father, Bradley, was also charged, but with 2 charges instead of 4. And I'll be honest, I don't know why he didn't face the same charges as Toni. They both lived in the same house. They were both responsible for keeping all of those children fed, safe, clean, taken care of. And they both completely dropped the ball and endangered the entire family. Not to mention, 3 of the 4 kids were biologically his, just as much as they were Toni's. Now, I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to child neglect law. I won't even try to be. But it doesn't make sense to me that they wouldn't face the exact same 4 charges. I guess that's besides the point, but it's still something that bothers me. So on May 18th, 2020, Toni took a plea deal where she pled guilty to 1 count of neglect, and she was sentenced to 900 days in jail for this. Her sentence ended up being suspended, and she was given 540 days of probation instead. Which don't even get me started because that just enrages me. Because she only served 21 days in jail in total. She was also ordered to take parenting classes, which, okay, like goody, but I don't know, where is she being reprimanded? This is just like out of control to me. I mean, neglect like what Toni was doing doesn't just come from a lack of knowledge. It's not like she needed a teacher to tell her to feed her kids, to clean them, to change their diapers. So going to a parenting class can't cure neglect that comes when you truly just don't give a shit about your own flesh and blood, right? And I'm sorry, but that kind of parenting isn't something that I think that you can fix in a classroom or bounce back from. It is something innately wrong with you. Now, those pointless parenting classes aside, I also cannot comprehend how you can literally be starving your newborn baby and somehow just get a slap on the wrist. But honestly, that's not even the most frustrating part about this case. Let me just continue. So after Toni and Bradley were arrested, both Kinsleigh and the other baby were taken into custody of the state. The court documents that I saw didn't say much about the other two children, and I'm not sure what became of them. I've got to imagine that they went to the other family members, or maybe the one that wasn't Bradley's went to his dad. I'm not sure. But speaking of Bradley, he and Toni ended up separating around 2020 or 2021. I don't know exactly what happened to him after that or what happened with his 2 charges of neglect, if he took a deal, served any time in jail, or had to take any classes, but it sounds like he was in and out of jail and rehab. I also know that he didn't have any real involvement in Kinsleigh's life for a long time after that point. Everything that happened from that separation onward was just on Toni's shoulders solely. So with Bradley out of the picture, she met a man named Ryan Smith, but things didn't get a whole lot better in their home life. At some point, Kinsleigh's paternal grandparents, Patricia and Brian Welty, ended up getting custody over her, and they welcomed Kinsleigh into their home with open arms. I mean, they were more than happy to take care of her. In their home, she was safe, happy, well-fed. She didn't have to deal with not being taken care of. She was this normal, happy little girl. They loved and cared for Kinsleigh, not like she was their grandchild, but like she was their own actual child. They had long discussions about whether they should adopt Kinsleigh permanently, and they really just wanted to give her a chance in life and raise her to always know unconditional love and support. However, their hopes and dreams of providing Kinsleigh with some sort of normalcy were ruined when Child Services decided that Kinsleigh was going to go back to her mother. So to say that Patricia and Brian were heartbroken was an absolute understatement. But there wasn't anything that they could do about it. She wasn't their biological child, and even though they had custody for quite some time, if DCS says that a kid is going back to their birth mom, that's just what's going to happen. Now, I'm not entirely sure what exactly happened next, because the information that's out there is pretty vague. But from what I can piece together, it sounds like while Kinsleigh was with her mom again, there were allegedly multiple DCS reports of different additional incidents of neglect. And they investigated and didn't like what they saw. Again, I know that's super vague information, and I'm sure that as the months go on, there will probably be more information about what exactly was going on. I mean, verified proof of what was going on. But for now, that's kind of all we know. Now, one thing for certain, though, Kinsleigh was being neglected her entire life, or at least any moment that she spent with her mother, Toni. So Kinsleigh was once again removed from her mom's care. The second time that Kinsleigh was sent back to her grandparents, she was covered in bruises from head to toe. Now keep in mind, the two of them had raised babies of their own, so they knew the difference between the normal bruises that you might get from playing on a playground versus something that's a sign that you have to worry. These bruises were definitely a level where they knew that Kinsleigh had not been taken care of the way that she needed to be. And not only that, but chunks of her already thin blonde hair were missing. And not just in one spot, but multiple different spots around her head. This was the second time that Kinsleigh's mom had lost custody of Kinsleigh after clearly mistreating her. And Patricia and Brian made it very clear to DCS the condition she was in when she returned to them was unacceptable. It was horrible. It was alarming. And they thought that if DCS knew just how terrible Kinsleigh looked when they received her, then maybe they would keep her far, far away from her mother. And after all of that, you would think that Kinsleigh's mom would basically be banned from ever having custody of Kinsleigh again, right? But sadly, that still was not the case. It didn't matter how much they pleaded and begged and how well Kinsleigh was doing in their care, nothing mattered. After a bit of time, the Department of Child Services said that she was once again going back to her mom, and that was final. So Kinsleigh went back home to live with her mom again. And DCS was supposed to keep checking in on her, making sure that her home life was actually stable, actually safe, and that all of the things were happening the way they were supposed to be. But it's recently become clear that apparently there was a little bit of a mix-up, I mean, to say the least. Or maybe we could even call it, I don't know, a lack of care to look any further into DCS's part. For part of the time, DCS didn't have a solid address to go to because they had moved houses. So maybe the authorities just straight up weren't able to do a welfare check on Kinsleigh, which is why everything continued on and went on for so long without anybody ever questioning it or evaluating her health. But as we'll see later, DCS did eventually get their new address, and they knew where to find her. Meanwhile, during the time that Kinsleigh was back in her mom's care, her grandparents were calling over and over, saying they were worried, they wanted DCS to look into Kinsleigh's situation. But their concerns were just ignored, swept under the rug. Literally, in 2021, the Weltys, the grandparents, called in for a welfare check, and their exact words were that they were afraid that Kinsleigh would die. That is a pretty specific and extreme concern, and that was from a whole 3 years ago. But the thing that put Kinsleigh's name and face in the news happened earlier this year. It's so recent that there are a bunch of details that haven't even come to light yet, and there's a lot of sources out there that are either super vague or a little bit mixed up, a little bit confusing. Luckily, we were able to get a hold of the official court documents, which explained in detail everything that happened on April 9th, 2024. That day, a call came into the Indianapolis Police Department around 5:15 p.m. The caller reported that there was an unresponsive child at the home in a trailer park in southwestern Indianapolis. As soon as the paramedics arrived, they found an unresponsive 5-year-old, who I'm sure you can guess by now was Kinsleigh. The paramedics did all of the normal life-saving measures, but even by the time that they arrived at the scene, it was pretty clear there was no bringing Kinsleigh back. Toni was there, and from the moment that the police arrived, she was over-explaining everything. She seemed less worried about what was happening to Kinsleigh and more focused on making sure that the police heard her version of the story. She told them that literally just 20 or 30 minutes prior, she had picked Kinsleigh up. Before that point, Kinsleigh had been with her dad for over a month and a half. She said as soon as she picked Kinsleigh up, Kinsleigh told her that she had a headache and that her legs were trembling. Toni didn't do much with that information at the time. But she said that the moment that they got inside the house, Kinsleigh collapsed, and that's when she called 911. But the EMTs knew that this was no freak accident. Between all of their training, their first-hand experience, first responders can spot when something fishy is going on. And basically, as soon as Toni opened up her mouth, the red flags started flying. See, Kinsleigh had a huge bruise on her face, and it didn't just look like it came from playing too hard with her siblings or maybe running into the side of a table or something like that. It was massive. She also had what appeared to be possible bite marks on her stomach area, which is horrifying, and I can't even tell you how many cases we have covered like this where bite marks are involved. It is unnerving and disgusting, and something that I will just never understand. Now, on top of all of that, Kinsleigh looked to be severely malnourished, like very, very bad, enough that these signs were visible just from looking at her. She also was absolutely filthy. She had lice, she had other bugs that were crawling all over her head and face, she had fecal matter covering her head, her hands, her feet. Her thin blonde hair was literally matted with human waste. It was clear that she hadn't been given a proper bath in God knows how long. So Kinsleigh was taken to the local children's hospital, where she was officially declared dead at 6:01 p.m. Her cause of death was severe malnourishment. She was just 5 years old. The reports that the hospital filled out said that Kinsleigh weighed more when she was just 2 years old than she did when she was now 5 years old. And that weight, it was only 21 pounds. That is absolutely insane to even imagine. My 3-year-old daughter, she's not even 3 yet, she's 36 pounds, I think? I think so, 36 pounds. 21 pounds for a 5-year-old? It is horrible to think about. So now the police had to figure out who did this to her, who mistreated this precious child so badly that she could be this thin and then die so tragically, die from essentially starvation. It was pretty obvious that Kinsleigh's mom had been lying back at the house when the first responders all showed up, and the fact that she also had this history of mistreating her kids, specifically Kinsleigh, it just made it even more obvious that the story that she was telling wasn't the truth, not at all. So the police sat down and they started questioning her. They gave her another chance to explain what had happened, and this was her version of what happened. She had been living with her new boyfriend Ryan at her current address for about 6 months. She also, terrifyingly, had given birth to a 5th child, which was her and Ryan's first child together. Apparently, in early February, Kinsleigh's dad reached out and told her that he wanted to spend more time with Kinsleigh. he wanted her to come and stay with him. She agreed to that plan, and in mid-February, she dropped Kinsleigh off with him. She said that she was in regular contact with him, though, and with Kinsleigh over the phone, but she never dropped by in person or FaceTimed her, or anything like that where she could visibly see her, so she couldn't see for herself just how skinny Kinsleigh was getting, or notice all of the bruises on her. So she says on the day that Kinsleigh ended up collapsing, Kinsleigh's dad had called Toni and told her that she needed to come get Kinsleigh because something came up with his job. He wasn't going to be able to keep Kinsleigh anymore. He had to go. Now, this next part is just beyond frustrating because honestly, it's like, how stupid do you think these interviewers are, these trained professionals? But Toni said that she met them at a local McDonald's to pick Kinsleigh up. And Kinsleigh's, hood was up on her sweatshirt, so she didn't see or notice anything off about Kinsleigh until after the dad left. Which I just have to say, you haven't seen your daughter in a full month and a half, and you didn't even glance at her face or take her hood down to kiss her, to say hello, to hug her, or get a good look at her. Now, apparently, as she was putting Kinsleigh into the car seat, she said that her hood did come down, and that's when she saw the bruise on her face, as well as her short, thin, matted hair. So then, during the car ride home, Kinsleigh started complaining about basically everything that was hurting her. And then the moment that they got home, Kinsleigh collapsed. And that's pretty much the exact same thing that she had told first responders, but this time in way more detail. And I highly doubt that anybody was buying her story at this point, but they did decide to kind of go along with it, ask some follow-up questions. And this only made Toni look a million times worse. Since Toni was essentially saying hey, I haven't seen the kid in over a month. I don't know what happened. You'll have to ask her dad. They were like, okay, sure. Do you have an address for Bradley so we can go talk to him, see him, ask him some questions? Well, big surprise, she had no idea where he lived. She reminded them that she met with Bradley at that McDonald's parking lot both times to drop off and pick up Kinsleigh, which, okay, fine, no big deal. Maybe you don't know his exact address. Do you at least have his phone number? And what do you know? She didn't have that either, even though she had said that she had kept in regular contact with Kinsleigh while she was with Bradley, so make that one make sense. When the investigators asked her when the last time Kinsleigh had been evaluated by DCS, she told them that it had been in December of 2022. But interestingly enough, DCS had actually been at her house earlier that morning, and you'll never believe why. The newborn that she literally just had with Ryan, the poor little newborn baby had tested positive for THC. Now, when I first read this, I had a lot of questions. I wondered how DCS even learned that the baby might have THC in its system. I also wondered if it was a secondhand smoke situation or if this baby literally had been given THC to digest. Obviously, either one shows a pretty significant level of neglect or just plain being a complete moron, but I wanted to throw those questions out there because I'm sure you're all wondering the same things. And I'll be honest though, I don't have any answers to that. I'm hoping that as the case progresses, we might learn a little bit more, but regardless, that just now makes multiple confirmed incidents of child neglect, or just times in general where DCS had to step in due to concerns between 2018 and 2024. And yet Toni somehow still had custody of her kids, which is beyond me. Now, according to Toni's story, Kinsleigh wasn't at home that morning. Remember, she was with her dad, Bradley, and that's why DCS didn't give Kinsleigh an evaluation or check if she was okay. They didn't see any sign that she was even there. Toni says that she went to pick her up after DCS left. Now, of course, Toni's entire story completely crumbled once the investigators headed back to her house to gather evidence and document everything. Because while they were there, Toni's mother, Tammy, arrived. Tammy and Toni must not have talked or gotten their story straight before all of this went down because Tammy completely threw Toni under the bus. Tammy told the detectives that Kinsleigh hadn't been staying with Bradley, and she honestly found that whole idea that she would be staying with Bradley laughable. Bradley had been in and out of jail and rehab for years, and he struggled with heroin addiction. When he was out of jail and rehab, it wasn't like he was super involved or dad of the year. Tammy said that he hadn't seen Kinsleigh or any of the other kids in so long that he probably wouldn't even recognize them out on the street if he saw them. So yeah, needless to say, Kinsleigh had not been living with Bradley for over a month. So this then raised a big question. If Kinsleigh wasn't at Bradley's house when DCS came to the house that morning, where was she? While Toni was dealing with all of the issues with her other baby, you have to hope that somebody was watching over Kinsleigh and making sure she was okay, right? Maybe it was her boyfriend Ryan, who knows? in which case you would think that the police would have had some pointed questions for him to maybe answer how Kinsleigh ended up so hurt, so sick. I mean, as bad as Toni was, she wouldn't just leave a 5-year-old completely unattended. Or maybe she would, given how neglected and malnourished she was. Well, the police started uncovering the answers to those questions the following day on April 10th, 2024. That's when they got a search warrant and started looking around Toni and Ryan's house. They walked into the back bedroom, which all looked pretty normal, or at least almost normal. There were bunk beds, some children's toys, and based on what they found there, the police figured that that was the room that probably belonged to the older boys. Oddly enough, there was a heavy dresser sitting directly in front of the closet door, blocking anybody from getting inside. Of course, the police thought that that was strange, so they moved this dresser and they opened the door. And then when they did, this huge wave of what smelled like urine and feces just came wafting out. And it's not hard to imagine why. There were feces all over the floor and all over the closet walls. And in those smears, there were tiny little handprints, which it is such a haunting detail because I just imagine Kinsleigh being trapped, barricaded in that closet, pooping herself, trying to clean herself, trying to get out, smearing it on the walls. It's giving me the chills. It's giving me like a visceral reaction. It is so disgusting and heartbreaking. Inside, there were also little girls' clothes that were filthy. They were heavily soiled with both urine and poop. There was also an uneaten peanut butter sandwich on white bread just on the floor. And even though the bread was pretty dry and hard, indicating that it had been lying there for a while, it wasn't moldy yet. So most likely it hadn't been made that day or anything, but also hadn't been sitting out for weeks. So the police went back to Toni. They wanted to ask her who had been locked in this closet. Obviously, whoever it was didn't get trapped in there by accident. Somebody knew somebody was in there and was feeding them, was barricading them in. Not to mention that her story about Kinsleigh staying with Bradley had obviously been a complete lie, and they weren't believing it either. So now when the detectives decided to bring up the closet and what they found inside of it, Toni still went with some ridiculous lie. She said that that room of the closet was in fact her older boy's room. Apparently, one of her sons was prone to having seizures, and he would urinate and defecate when he was having an episode, which is why he was held inside the closet when he would do so. But that doesn't explain why there were little handprints on the wall or a peanut butter sandwich on the floor. Obviously, he wasn't making himself a snack while he was having a seizure. Not to mention the dresser blocking that door or the girl's clothing that had all of the feces all over it. Plus, if someone really does have a seizure disorder, you don't handle it by locking that person in a closet with their own filth. You get them a doctor to try and get this seizure under control. And even if you haven't quite worked out the right medications yet, and the seizures are still happening, you don't leave all the urine and all the feces on the floor and on the wall to just dry and stay there forever. You clean it up. I mean, this story was so obviously a lie. But even if it was the truth, I don't know why Toni thought that it was a good answer or evidence that she wasn't neglectful. I mean, like that is any better. So after this complete BS interview, Toni went back to her car and slept a little while the police were still searching her home. Afterwards, the detectives asked her to meet up with them at their offices, which I can only imagine she was probably sweating and beginning to now panic in those moments. Once they were all inside, the detectives read Toni her Miranda rights, and at that moment, she completely folded. She immediately told them that everything that she had previously said was all a lie. She admitted that Bradley wasn't involved in Kinsleigh's life or her death, and she guessed that he probably hadn't seen Kinsleigh in around a year. She even said that she highly doubted he even knew that she was dead. But then she started claiming that Kinsleigh had behavioral problems, and Kinsleigh hated her. And it almost sounded like she was feeling sorry for herself, whining that nobody would help her out and that her mother Tammy was partially at fault for all of this because she knew everything about what was happening to Kinsleigh. Basically, she was just pointing the fingers at anybody she could, but she was careful not to throw her boyfriend under the bus. She said that Ryan was a great guy, that he and his family had nothing to do with what happened. The sad truth was that Kinsleigh had spent the majority of every single day over the past few months inside that closet. Toni said that she would let her out if they were all going somewhere, but as soon as they got back home, Kinsleigh would put herself in that closet because she knew that if she didn't go in there voluntarily, her mom would put her in there herself, and that it was pointless to even fight it. Which, can you just imagine that for a moment? If you've ever encountered a 5-year-old, if you've ever had a 5-year-old yourself, they're pretty resilient. if you tell them it's time out, even if they're good listeners, they'll go. But the fact that she was so broken down that the moment they returned from any outing, that she just automatically walked inside that closet herself without even having been told to do so, it's a whole different kind of evil, right? It's like, not only are you hurting this child emotionally, physically, starving her, you are completely breaking her spirit and her will to where she's just walking into this closet knowing she's going to be locked in there anyway and not even trying to fight it. It's, to me, that's almost worse than the physical aspect. I don't know. Like, there's just something about a child who's so innocent and is usually so full of life and so vibrant and has, tenacity, spirit, happiness, innocence, purity, to be so broken down that they don't even do that. It's really heartbreaking. And when they asked Toni why she did that to poor Kinsleigh, she said that it was just easier for her to stay in the closet so that she didn't have to deal with her. And I wish I could say that that was the worst thing that she said during this interview, but it only gets worse. She said that she rarely fed Kinsleigh, even though she could hear her yelling constantly that she was hungry and thirsty. She literally said it became her slogan, which is such an odd and insensitive way to describe that. She's calling out for hunger, for water. Like, are you a monster? I don't even know why I'm asking that. Yes, you are a monster, but like, what? Why do you even want these kids? Why are you even fighting for custody? Toni also claimed that both her mom, Tammy, and Ryan saw how frail Kinsleigh was getting, and they confronted her, saying that Kinsleigh needed help. They even told her that she was going to die if things didn't turn around really fast. And even though they gave her all of these warnings, Toni chose not to do anything because she said she didn't want her other kids to be taken away again, and she didn't want to get into any trouble. I mentioned earlier that DCS had been at their house just a few hours before Kinsleigh died, but they hadn't seen her. Toni said this was because Kinsleigh was asleep and underneath a blanket in one of the back rooms, and DCS never checked that room. She also lied and told them that Kinsleigh was with her grandparents, probably hoping that they wouldn't look around and check for her. So that bruise on Kinsleigh's face, that really large one that they saw, that apparently had been from Toni hitting her after Kinsleigh had bit her arm. Her short hair had been from Toni cutting out the feces that was matted, dried, and smeared in it. And I can't believe I'm even about to say what I am about to say, but Toni told the detectives that when it came to caring for Kinsleigh, she, quote, did the bare fucking minimum. Honestly, I don't even think that was true because she wasn't even doing the minimum. But at least she realized that she wasn't doing a great job and she wasn't actually trying to act like she did love or care about her daughter. But see what I meant earlier when I said that parenting classes weren't helping, would never help, that this is just something innately wrong in somebody's soul? Toni knew that she was a horrible mom already, but she just couldn't be bothered to be better. And not only that, but she admitted that she had wanted Kinsleigh to be out of her life for quite some time, and she wished that she had never even been born to begin with. It breaks my heart that Kinsleigh's grandparents wanted her in their lives so badly and wanted it to be a permanent thing. And if Toni really didn't want to take care of her, all she had to do was work something out with them, give Kinsleigh to them. She didn't need to hide out from child services. She didn't need to go on the run. She didn't need to fight so hard to keep a girl that she literally didn't even want. And I just hate the fact that Kinsleigh had to leave this world feeling unloved and unwanted. Now, there was one part of Toni's original story that was true. Kinsleigh really did complain that her legs and her head hurt. And in a heartbreaking detail, if it could even get any worse, right before she collapsed that morning, she also told Toni that she wanted to die. A 5-year-old should hardly even understand the concept of life and death, let alone be so sick and in such pain that she is wishing for death. Needless to say, Toni was a terrible mother. And actually, I take that back. She doesn't even deserve to be called a mother. She is not a mother. She does not warrant anything close to that title. And even though she said that nobody should blame her husband, Ryan, and he was innocent and all of that, it's very hard to take that seriously. All of this was happening under his roof. He knew about it. He warned her. They were expressing concerns, which they should have taken those concerns to the authorities, because it's not okay to just say something and drop it there. He could have done a lot more to save this girl's life. Ryan told the investigators that putting Kinsleigh in the closet had started around Thanksgiving 2023, and they did it because, quote, it was safer for everybody else. That explanation makes it seem like Kinsleigh was this extremely troubled little girl who tried to cause harm to her family, which I don't recall was ever even brought up. So I'm genuinely curious to know why Ryan and Toni had that explanation for this whole thing. Needless to say, even if that was the case, it still wouldn't make it okay. But remember, she was thriving in the care of the grandparents. So now she was somehow like this rebellious, harmful, dangerous 5-year-old? I doubt it. And as if that isn't already just completely messed up in and of itself, they started calling this closet the cage. Like this sweet little girl was some kind of vicious, wild zoo animal that needed to be locked up away from everybody else. Ryan claimed that he only really had noticed how badly Kinsleigh was getting about 4 or 5 months prior. She was just not in a good state physically, and Ryan claimed that he got mad at Toni and even threatened to call 911 over it. Now, of course, those threats stayed just that, threats. He told the investigators that he just couldn't call 911 or get any help for Kinsleigh because he loved Toni. He loved her so much. He didn't want her to get in trouble, which is ironic because she was in so much more trouble than she would have been if he had maybe intervened earlier. On April 10th, 2024, both Toni and Ryan were arrested, and then both of their phones were seized and put into evidence. Toni was charged with murder, criminal confinement, and battery on a person less than 12 years old. Ryan was charged with 3 counts of neglect resulting in death and criminal confinement. But the police weren't done there. Because remember, Ryan wasn't the only one who was warning Toni about what was happening to Kinsleigh. Her mom, Tammy, was as well. Not only had Tammy been aware of every terrible thing that was going on, but it seemed like she did a pretty fair share of abusing and neglecting Kinsleigh all on her own. Apparently, Tammy regularly kept Kinsleigh on the weekends. She had a job as a kitchen manager at a local elementary school, and one day she apparently told one of her coworkers that when Kinsleigh would spend the night, she had to tie her to the bed all so that Tammy could get some sleep. If she didn't tie her to the bed, Kinsleigh would apparently get up to go find food and water, which, God forbid, a hungry little girl wanted to be fed, and that messes up your sleep schedule, so you have to tie her up. I mean, are you serious? So that was already bad enough. But the detectives later learned from Tammy herself that tying her to the bed, it just wasn't working. And she admitted that during the summer of 2023, when Kinsleigh was staying with her pretty often, she would then start duct taping her to the bed. It started out that just her legs were duct taped, but Kinsleigh got out of that pretty easily, so then things escalated and she started duct taping her shoulders. And when that still wasn't enough, she resorted to taping all the way up Kinsleigh's legs, leaving no wiggle room at all. Literally, it was so cruel and terrible, and I've got to say, if this was Tammy's idea of good parenting, it's honestly no wonder Toni turned out the way that she did. So Tammy was arrested on April 12th, 2024, and she was charged with criminal confinement. Her phone was also seized at the time of her arrest, and it was taken into evidence. But more recently, the criminal confinement charge was dropped after she was charged with 2 felony counts of neglect of a dependent resulting in death, along with additional neglect counts and a misdemeanor count of failure to make a report. So I kept mentioning how they seized the phones, right? Well, once investigators had seized the electronics, they found way more evidence of Tammy's involvement. There was a Facebook message thread between Tammy and Toni where Kinsleigh, or should I say the torturing of Kinsleigh, was often discussed. The messages confirmed that Tammy was, quote, taking care of Kinsleigh a lot, but not really taking care of her. Instead, Tammy would message back and forth with Toni, and they would refer to Kinsleigh as things like evil, demon, dipshit, dummy, chunkers, heifer, things like that. And on top of that, they would discuss how to literally Kinsleigh. In May of 2022, Kinsleigh had gotten out of that closet, and her grandma told her mom, put something in front of the door so she can't push the door. You're going to have to keep her home one weekend just to show her you mean business. And then Toni said, she hates being smacked on the belly, just so you know. And Tammy says, oh, I know. In another incident from May of 2023, Toni sent a photo of Kinsleigh crouching by a couch, and Tammy said, did you not wrap her ass up? To which Toni responded, yes, I did. She got out. And Tammy said, damn, do it tighter. A couple of months later in July, Toni had asked her mom to watch Kinsleigh, but she said she had to work and she was too tired. So Toni responded, "Do your duct tape thing. Sleep. I won't ask again." Then a few months later, there was another time that Toni had messaged her mom to say that Kinsleigh had almost gotten out of the closet. And Tammy responded, "Tape her ass down." A month after that, Kinsleigh apparently did get out of the closet, and apparently she shoved feces underneath the couch. I'm sure you can guess what Tammy's solution to that was. Quote, "Tie her fucking ass up." Not only the level of cruelty in all of this, but the carelessness, the callousness. They're just casually instructing this horrible, horrific behavior. It's unthinkable. It truly is unthinkable. And not only were Tammy and Toni discussing how to inflict this horrible stuff on this poor little girl, poor Kinsleigh, but they were also trying to figure out how to keep their behavior under wraps. Just a few months ago in January, Tammy had reached out to ask if she was watching the kids that day. And Toni responded, "It doesn't matter." And she wrote, "As long as you promise if one of the bitches shows up that you make them leave and tell them that the children aren't there, that's the only thing that I worry about." So then when DCS did show up in March, Tammy let Toni know, which she responded, "Oh, Jesus Christ, I guess we need to figure out a day where you can take Kinsleigh and I can deal with it, but I just really don't want to." And then there was one final message, which was on the same morning of Kinsleigh's death. Toni told her mom, "So I don't have much in my fridge or in my cabinets, but DCS is coming out today. Call me on your lunch." It's so odd to me because it seems so clear that they were colluding with each other, not only on the behavior that was inflicted, but on the cover-up, on, "Oh no, DCS is coming. What should I do? Let's strategize. Let's talk." It's horrific. Horrific. Since then, Ryan has posted his own $50,000 bail, while Toni and Tammy were both being held in the county jail. Kinsleigh's family and the ones who actually cared about her have been fighting for justice ever since the moment they learned that she passed. And the reason that this case is so important to talk about, even though it's very difficult to hear, I know, but it's because it brings up the question that's always an issue with child services. A lot of the time, social workers assume it's best for a child who's been removed from their family to go back to their parents if that is at all possible. But obviously, that's not always how it works out. A lot of the time, the child was removed for a reason, but people at child services will generally work with the parent and try to get them to reunite with the family, like how Toni got her kids back after she took those dumb parenting classes. Sometimes it is a good thing. Sometimes the parents really do turn it around and they end up giving their kids a loving, stable home. Frankly, sometimes child services make mistakes too, and they remove kids who weren't actually in danger to begin with. But it's okay to acknowledge that truth while also noting that there are some people who just should not be parents. And taking their kids away for good is sometimes the only way to keep them safe and, in this case, keep them alive. It's not good for anyone to assume by default that it's a victory for them to go back to their parents. They need to look at the situation. They need to assess it. Kinsleigh's grandparents, Patricia and Brian, both wanted Kinsleigh in their lives. They wanted to love her, nurture her, take care of her. Yet DCS, their ultimate goal was reunification with Toni, who had proven over and over again that she was neglectful and an unsafe environment for Kinsleigh.
Your priority should be the children, their safety. It shouldn't be getting them back if the parent's not the safe person. And they failed her. I just want justice for Kinsleigh. I pray to God that they don't plead this down. I pray every charge sticks.
And what's even more frustrating is the fact that DCS was literally just a few rooms away from Kinsleigh in the final hours before she passed, and they didn't even know it. They released a statement after Kinsleigh's passing saying, and I'm quoting here, that their top priority is child safety. We are always saddened when a child tragedy occurs, and we partner with stakeholders from across the state to thoroughly investigate all child deaths in Indiana that involve abuse or neglect. As I'm sure you can imagine, Kinsleigh's family argues that it's just not enough. They knew Toni was neglectful. They hadn't been able to lay eyes on Kinsleigh in months. They saw the conditions of Toni and Ryan's home, not to mention that DCS was there that day because the newborn had THC in its system. If Kinsleigh's own mom wasn't going to protect her and her boyfriend, her mother, and DCS weren't going to protect her, who was supposed to protect her? Are we just supposed to hope and pray that all parents will always have their children's best interests at heart and will keep them safe? That's just not the reality. And it doesn't really feel right to only put the blame on Toni, Ryan, and Tammy when there were plenty of warning signs and red flags over the years. But I'm curious to know what you guys think about situations like this. I don't know the answer to fix this broken system. But what I do know is we have to get better somehow. How do things like this continue to happen over and over again? I don't know. And I wish I could have like the magic unlock. I need somebody much smarter than me to figure that out. But there has to be a way to intervene before it gets this bad and to have a permanent solution to secure the children's safety. I know that this one was difficult to hear, guys. I know it wasn't easy, and I'm sure a lot of people already dropped out but because of how hard it was. But it is so important to continue to give Kinsleigh a voice. Not only give her a voice, but raise awareness about this issue. So for those of you who did stick through till this moment, till the end, thank you. Thank you for hearing her voice. Thank you for hearing her story. And thank you for continuing to generate the awareness and hold these people accountable. Until the next one, guys, please stay safe.